बड़े चित्त चोर बल मारे तोरे नैना बड़े चित्त चोर काहे चोटी बतिया बनाए बल
Good evening, everyone. We're delighted to welcome you to another edition of the Right Circle series. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our partners, the Prabha Khaitan Foundation, Shri Cement, ITC Rajputana, SAS Women of Jaipur, and Spajia Foundation. We have today a very, very special Right Circle with Rukmini ji here. Rukmini is an independent data communicator and her journalistic work focuses on inequality, gender, caste and politics. She was the national data editor of the Hindu and HuffPost India and has also written for a range of Indian and international publications. She's won the Likho Awards for Excellence in Media and her first book, Whole Numbers and Half Truths, which we're also giving away today to everyone, won the Tata Lit Live First Book Award in the Non-Fiction category in 2022. And I hear that a second book is coming out this year. Okay, we will leave that for the discussion. And in conversation with Rukmini will be Chirag Patel. Chirag's list of accolades and achievements is so long. I'm going to go through a small bit of them before I leave the stage to both of them. Chirag is an advisor and mentor to a lot of startups in sports, health, wellness, climate change and financial services. He's the founder of a bespoke advisory firm called Samanya and the managing partner of a venture development firm, Triarch Ventures. He's also the managing trustee of KOOH Sports Foundation and is a board member of TIE Rajasthan, among a lot of other things that he has done. But I will invite Rukmini and Chirag on stage to do the conversation today, and I'm going to leave it to you guys. Can we have a huge round of applause for them, please?
It's been phenomenal last 2 weeks since I got introduced to you by Meeta. And I just want to tell you guys, when you pick your book up, this is perhaps the first book where you move forward 8 steps and then you'll take 16 steps back. That's this book. It is amazingly well written. I'm not a curator or some specialist as well, but it's really excited me to ask you some easy questions through the evening. So let's start with the first one. What made you write this book, and what was actually troubling you that made you write this book?
So first of all, thank you very much for having me. Thank you for your warm hospitality. It's always lovely to be in Jaipur. And thank you, Chirag. You're wearing it very lightly, but it's not just that you found the book interesting, but you've put in a lot of work into making today's conversation engaging. So I really appreciate that. And I'm also just so happy to be here at this gathering. There are many things that can bring people together, but the idea that ideas and a love of books and ideas can bring people together is a lovely thought. We don't have to agree on most things or anything at all, but to come together to share ideas is a lovely thing to have. So I'm very pleased to be here. What was troubling me when I wrote the book was the sense that there was information that should have been more widely known, and I felt like a unfair keeper of knowledge that didn't belong to me, that should have been widely known. And I'll explain what that means. I was a field reporter, a regular journalist in newspapers for several years, and then moved to doing data journalism. I have no background in maths or statistics or economics or anything useful, and I learned all of this on the job. And when I say all of this, what I mean is the ability to look at government numbers and make sense of them. Now, these are not numbers that are hidden away or that I have exclusive access to. They are equally available to you and me, but because they are so difficult to look at, the knowledge that we should all have from these numbers is restricted to me and a few others who have learned the language of government numbers. We've not learned advanced statistics, we've just learned to look at these numbers. And over time I realized that I had some insights from this data that felt like it shouldn't belong to me alone. It should be out there, and it's only the difficulty of accessing this data that stopped people from having this information. And not having this information has fundamentally altered the way most people see the country. They think of it as richer than it is. They think of it as perhaps more tolerant than it is. They think of it as more equal than it is. But there are also, other things. They think of it as much more diverse, perhaps, than it is in some ways. So it felt like this shouldn't be information that's mine alone, and that's what I wanted to do. That's
more
what
liberal than it is as well.
More
right?
liberal than
Okay.
it is.
Perfect, thank you. The format I'm going to use here is because it's such a data-heavy book, and I'm assuming that none of you have read the book or got some insight into that. So we're going to flip through some key aspects which I've extracted from the book with Rukmini's permission, and then we just sort of discuss this point. So let's go with the first one. Let's get cracking. If this works, yeah, that works. Okay. So this is from chapter 1, or how India tangles with the cops and the courts as well. I mean, it took me a long time to read this. But there's this specific point on page 5. So you will see reference to the book here. So if anybody wants to take notes, please do that. But what is this about? I mean, I've understood it, but if you can just tell the audience, what is it that you're trying to say? What's the message here?
So let me start by saying that the minute you represent numbers, first of all, the minute you pull out a single number and then represent it as a chart, it gives a far more sciencey version of the book than it actually is. I would like to think that at least this chapter reads more like a crime thriller or an OTT show on Netflix than this chart makes it seem. So please don't be daunted by the appearance of grid lines. So I'll tell you what the story here is. In 2012, I lived in Delhi at the time, and there was a assault of a young woman that shocked the country as it should have, and there was this long overdue conversation about the safety of women that erupted across the country, and the force with which it erupted sort of showed how much it had been on people's minds, on young people's minds, and that it was long overdue. But what bothered me was that most of the conversation was being driven by police statistics. Police statistics was the numbers we were using as proxy for more safe, less safe, more crime, less crime. And the reason I knew this was a problem was not because of any understanding of numbers, but because of an understanding of police stations. Now, as a field reporter, I had spent a lot of time hanging around police stations, essentially waiting for some sort of crime to happen so that I could
hopefully outside.
No, inside police stations. Reporters hang out inside police stations, hoping for something to happen so that I could go home for the night. And anyone who spent any time inside a police station knows that if all that goes down there is put down in an FIR, it's pretty far from any sort of objective notion of reality, right? You know that it represents the push and pull of many forces, but it isn't simple science. It isn't math for sure. So this started bothering me that we were using FIRs as the building block for understanding our country. And so what I decided to do is I looked at court cases instead, because there's just much more documentation, and I could talk to judges, I could talk to parties on both sides, lawyers, I could attend some cases as well. And the long and short of it is, after looking at 1 year of court cases in Delhi's 7 district courts, so this was more than 650 cases in all, I found that the largest share of what was going down in police statistics as assault of women was actually consenting relationships that the parents were objecting to. So they were filing these charges against young men, and they were filing kidnapping charges because these were sometimes intercaste and interreligious relationships that parents objected to. Now, in the years that have followed, we see a lot more news reporting around this, and we're aware that this is happening. But this is what the numbers were showing. Now, none of this is to say that, that there is no violence against women, but it is to say that if you use the violence of women IPC section, violence against women IPC section alone to understand crime and say it's going up or down or more here or more there, it's very likely that a lot of what you're actually capturing is parental disapproval of consenting romantic relationships, often sometimes between underage couples, sometimes between couples who are very young. So there's the whole universe of that's hidden behind police statistics. So maybe if you can see the tip of the iceberg what you're missing is all that's below.
Fantastic. As a father of two daughters, this is something I can use as a tool or not use as a tool, I guess. But I think this is shocking in the sense that what for me what was shocking is that intuitively it makes sense. We have parents objecting to relationships as well. But to the extent they go back and put that young couple or consenting, youth into trouble is also something I think is a big social issue, I guess we all need to understand as well and grapple with as well. So yeah, this was a great, fantastic chapter once again, interweaving of cops and the courts as well. Okay, so I think you touched upon this, Rukmini, in your preamble, but just give us a little bit more on how did you go about doing that research, because that must be a process by itself. And what were the specific shortcomings you think, and what can we do to really improve that going forward for a better understanding of the information?
Yeah, so that's a great point, and I think there's the sense often about Indian data is that what must be lacking is that the data doesn't exist, right? There's often a sense that there simply isn't good enough data about India. But I think this process of looking for the numbers and trying to understand the landscape of Indian data has shown me that yes, there are some areas in which numbers are lacking, but a far bigger problem is the lack of understanding of numbers that do exist, the lack of context with which numbers are presented. So crime is a very good example of the lack of context. So what you regularly see in the media, for example, is this state is more unsafe for women compared to that state, while what I've often found is that perhaps that's just a proxy for one state being better able to capture crime than the others. And if you present these numbers without context, you're doing a grave disservice to the understanding of what you were attempting to originally talk about. So the lack of context, then the lack of any explanation or understanding of methodology. Nobody feels the need to either explain or understand to people how numbers are collected, as a result of which there is so much suspicion about numbers that surely these numbers can't capture India properly, surely they're fudged, surely they're fake, because we don't explain to people how they're collected. So this suspicion grows. And we also don't tell people where to look at the numbers themselves. If they want to, they can check these numbers. So that's I think another big shortcoming. Then in academia and in the media, I think there's a huge failure of imagination. The same 4 or 5 dimensions are the ones along which people have looked at numbers for years and years, while this entire universe of other interesting things exists that just simply isn't looked at, because there's sort of groupthink about what we should look at with these numbers.
And what are the bodies, what are the key institutions do you think that which is capturing India's numbers?
So this is actually something that I found quite, if something inspires patriotism in me, I think this is actually, or sort of nationalistic feelings, it is great pride in India's statistical machinery. I didn't expect to feel that. When you look at what happened at the moment of independence, this was a poor country at pretty low levels of development that put in place a statistical system that was the envy of not just the developing world, but many in the developed world as well. For the simple reason, it was an audacious enterprise, and the reason for shooting, it was like the moon mission. It feels like a ISRO story that someone should make for Netflix again. It's inspiring what PC Mahalanobis and Nehru did at the time. And the reason was because there was a genuinely nation-building feeling there, that we're going to use numbers. That numbers are essential for planning and development. So let's put in place a great system to collect those numbers. And they did really innovative stuff that you associate with a more modern time. For example, now household surveys, which are sample surveys, are the sort of bedrock of how everybody tries to understand a country, especially such a big country. But at that time, it was still a case that needed to be made, that you can look at a sample and that will tell you about the whole country. It was a hard case to make.
Right.
And the way the Indian Statistical Institute made the case then was by actually doing a field survey. At the time, estimating yields from agricultural land was a big debate, because you never knew how to do it, and it was important because you needed to prepare. So the Bengal presidency in the 1930s, through a sort of open challenge, they asked their agricultural department to do it the usual way. You go plot by plot and you do it. And the ISI did a sample survey, and the sample survey ended up predicting the results better than the plot by. So this is how they actually demonstrated it. It feels like such a innovative and modern way of thinking that you've thought of a new statistical system. Sure, go out, try it. Try it on for a government exercise, and let's see who does a better job, and let's use the better system. That house that Nehru and Mahalanobis built holds us in good stead even now. And it doesn't have to do with two men alone, it has to do with the work that many have put in since then.
Sure.
But building a system of international standards that was supervised globally, that has many checks and balances, is the reason we still produce numbers that are trustworthy. And I really do urge this. I think there's sometimes too much suspicion about government numbers. When there is cause for suspicion, let's be suspicious. But let's not be blanket suspicious, because then you don't believe anything. So that seems like intellectual laziness, to just say everything seems suspicious and let's not believe anything.
Correct. Lovely, thank you. If anybody has a specific question, please fire away as we go along. Next one. So how do we think, feel and believe is the next chapter. And this is also, I think everything is shocking. Whatever you discovered through the book is shocking. So I think I'm not, after looking at this slide, I give everybody like 2 seconds to read this. I've come to a conclusion that I'm no longer going to be classed as a youth.
Now came to
Yeah, because I thought it was fashionable to be young, but look at that. I mean, this is shocking, and this is exactly the point. This is the underpinning of this book. And just talk us through this, not just the statistics, but how do you just sort of come about this revelation?
So when I say that there are a lot of numbers that exist but that people haven't paid enough attention to for a while, I usually mean sort of big official government data sets. But there's also good opinion polling that is being done for 50-60 years along the same lines,
Yeah.
that should have told us things about the country that have only now seemed to surprise people. And it makes me feel that we've just not paid enough attention to the numbers for a long time. And again, I mean, I don't want to get normative about what's good or bad. Let's talk first about what the numbers show, which is that if, from the classic definition of what conservative values are, which is to be opposed to intermingling of groups. Suppose we think of that as a co-conservative idea. For decades now, Indian opinion polling on India has shown that Indians across religious groups, across caste groups, across education levels and across the country are broadly opposed to intermingling of groups. They don't want neighbors of another religion, and I make the point with specific names in the book, but I generally make the point here that it is about all religious groups. This isn't about one group or the other. There is a broad hostility towards intergroup mixing, which then extends particularly to marriage as well. Now, I think there is a sort of notion that in most countries, as they get richer, more urbanized, more educated, that there is a broad shift towards classic American liberal values. And I think the numbers for a while in India have shown that that is not the case. Younger people do not show particularly different values than older people in most surveys. We see this not just in what they say they believe, but also in their actual actions. The share of intercaste marriages among people in their 20s is no different from among people in their 90s. It did not change in 70 years. It's still in single digits. It did not change. So it's not just what people are saying they believe, it's also what they actually do. So if there was a notion that younger people have more classic American liberal values, it was a fantasy, an imagined sort of belief that wasn't shown in the numbers. And then it should not surprise people to see actions including sort of intercaste marriage, but even things like voting patterns, even things like broad support for sort of big sociological changes. So if to me the bottom line in this also is that if the project is for change, suppose there are people who feel that we should all be more tolerant, we should all be, uh, not so opposed to intergroup mixing, it should be okay to have neighbors of every religion and for people to marry whoever they want.
Religion, caste,
Religion, caste,
yeah.
all of that. It will take work. It's not going to happen automatically. If the sort of political science assumption is that as the country gets richer, this will happen automatically, it's not going to happen automatically. So, in fact, there was a survey which I quote in the book that is of 5 states. That's a youth survey, talks to young people only. A majority of the people who in that survey, the majority of the young people who answered that survey, supported bringing in a law to outlaw interreligious marriage. So it isn't like mild lack of acceptance. It is the willingness to go the legal route.
So I can suggest one intervention. It is up to you to accept it or not.
I personally,
yeah, exactly. That's why I'm also intercaste. From my side of the family, they threw me out. But perhaps you should do the survey for the aging population, 50 plus. And I think our views will be diametrically opposite a lot of this in a lot many contexts as well. So maybe we should do that.
So I'm going to, strike a contrary note here, which is, and this is something that runs through the book and my feelings in general, which is that we all live in very strong bubbles and we need to be very conscious of that. And these are happy bubbles. So we're surrounded by people who also are in intercaste marriages, who are also tolerant people. But it gives you a view of the country that is not, generalizable.
Yeah.
So when we see this and we feel that older people may feel differently, I think what we're really thinking is our friends may feel differently or our peer group.
Sure.
But essentially, what stands out about younger people is not so much that they are much more conservative. It is that this, if we're calling it conservatism, broadly runs through the country, runs through everyone. Or sort of broadly runs through the median Indian.
Yeah. I was just thinking, because we've consumed, a lot of us are educated, we've seen both sides of the coin, perhaps the outcomes may be different. And talking about bubbles, forget about other cohort groups. With a family of 4, we struggled in the COVID bubble between the 4 of us as well. So I think post-COVID also, maybe that people, at least people like us, are perhaps more tolerant. But anyway, we'll see how that goes. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Very relevant point, I think, for us to discuss. There's a lot of stuff which we've written here, but just not to steal your thunder, I just wanted to sort of lay the context here for you to then flesh this out, is that on the left-hand side is the common narrative which we consume through multiple sources in media. And I'm sure most people would have heard this, read about this, particularly during election times, and what the actual facts are. And there are many things around that. I just cherry-picked certain points with Rukmini's permission, so that we can sort of compare and contrast between the half-truth and what the real numbers are as well. But that's the headline, that the opinion polling, which we place so much emphasis, perhaps right before we vote as well, and actually what the real truth is as well. So I think the lesson here is how to avoid easy narratives, but if you can just lead the audience through that.
Sure. I think there's really nowhere where narratives have dominated as much and in perhaps a damaging way as in the field of politics and reporting around politics.
Yeah.
So there has developed these theories around Indian voters, around their relationship with politics and political parties that are not just common in the media but also common in academia, and have really very little to do with underlying
and WhatsApp groups as well.
WhatsApp groups as well. You're elevating it.
Yeah.
So one of these, for example, is that the Indian voter, only cares about jobs and the economy. Caste, religion, all relegated to the 50s. That's just not relevant to elections anymore. One of my frustrations is that some of this relies on a very barefaced reading of opinion polls. So, opinion polls, typically the first question will be, what are you going to vote for in the next election? And every sort of God-fearing respondent says jobs, the economy, all of the things, all of the virtue signaling sort of responses that they feel sound good. But in the same survey, and this is the details are in the book. In the same survey, if you also ask, does it matter to you that the candidate in your constituency should be of the same caste as you? Nearly half said yes. So it doesn't mean that there is only one thing. It doesn't mean that Indian voters vote only on caste and don't care about ideas. That's a very reductive take as well. Just as we are capable of holding more than one idea in our mind at the time, I mean, the majority of Indian voters are. But it certainly means that one narrative around the Indian voter is just too flat and shallow and damaging. So then to take election results as a referendum on either a good performance on the economy or on delivering well on development is equally shallow. I think there is also sometimes this temptation to valorize and sort of make the Indian voter almost some sort of godly figure, particularly in the media, or rather there's a temptation to go one way or the other. Either you make them a godly figure who only cares about development, or you make them someone who only cares about money, and we're not able to sort of bring in nuance. Now, the thing about voter turnout, for example, when voter turnout, there is just so much misreading of this. Voter turnouts often improve because of work by the Election Commission to fix the voter list. So in the voter turnout, if you remember school maths, there's a numerator and a denominator. The numerator is voters, the denominator is how many people are on the electoral rolls. So if you fix the electoral rolls by weeding out duplicates and other things, and you reduce the denominator, that also makes the voter turnout go up. Another thing that's happened, as you pointed out over here, is that there has been a huge increase in female voter turnout. Now, again, this is in large part to do with pretty concerted work by the Election Commission to make this happen. But when voter turnout goes up, it's often seen as this is a wave, people are voting for this, people are voting for that, without actually thinking of more boring bureaucratic stuff, like the Election Commission went door to door, tried to get women to vote and remove duplicates. That's actually a big part of the explanation as well. Similarly, there is, what will typically happen is that your South Bombay, South Delhi will have low voter turnout, and then there'll be newspaper headlines that say, the rich don't want to come out to vote, and they've gone on holiday. Exactly. This is like a perennial headline. Now, the fact is that there are no rich constituencies in India. Our constituencies are huge, and as we'll talk about in a bit, the rich are very few in India. So for a constituency to be very rich, it could be maybe in a one ward, in a ward election, maybe one is particularly well off. But constituencies are very mixed. Those of you who know Bombay well, for example, will know that even the richest parts of, the reason that the richest parts of Bombay work so well is that there'll be a vast slum close by where all of the people who work in the houses of those people live. So in an election, everybody there votes. This example, I think this is a constituency in Hyderabad, for example, which had very low voter turnout, and then again, it was the rich areas within that constituency that was singled out in the media. But it's just a very poor understanding of what and particularly in Lok Sabha elections, these are vast, these are 1 million people, these are enormous constituencies. So to think of them as, it's just very reductive, it's a temptation to sort of give in to headlines that you feel people will, lap up. But we should be doing better also as readers. We should be demanding a little bit better and sort of seeing through some of this, even if the media is not doing a good enough job.
I think one underlying message I took from this, which is very heartening, is that the women are voting, and that's evident as well. And there's a fantastic case study about this girl from a Rajasthan village, where she convinces her mom, who's discouraging her to go to vote, and what she tells her and how she drags her to vote as well. There's an interesting case study there, and I think that is emblematic of what your overall research is as well. So good. There is a lot to this, guys, by the way, but I've been I've been constrained by time. So, Rukmini, how do you think we should think about narratives? I mean, obviously, I think you need to preach here, given you are a journalist as well. So, as a common layman, how should we weed out the narratives, and what should we and what should we not do? In other words, not fall prey for the narrative. What are the 2-3 things you can guide us, like steps to take?
So I do want to start by saying that it shouldn't be the job of readers to have to do this extra work. So, I do think that we've shifted the locus of responsibility. I don't mean I mean even in conversations about the media, there is sometimes a shift of the locus of responsibility onto readers. Almost the sense that readers have to be fact checkers of the media. And I do want to keep that locus of responsibility on the media, whose job it is to not do such a poor job of telling numbers. But so that's one side of it. But if we want to be pragmatic and think about what we can do given the current state of the media, stories and narratives, the better told they are, the more seductive they are. They're very gripping, as I often talk about. Although I'm looking at numbers, but the reason the book is full of stories is because from all my reporting, what stays with me are stories of people. I am a fiction reader. Just as much as anyone else, I love a good story. And so the temptation to see one story as emblematic of something is great. I think good storytellers are extremely powerful and take us all in. They may be, politicians, they may be journalists, they may be, sellers of fake pharmaceuticals. Anyone who tells a good story can take people in very easily. So I think wanting to see the underlying information is something that the more we do, the better it is. If we are not able to do this work ourselves, perhaps the least we can do is draw a bar that if the narrative or if what I'm reading doesn't give the source of the information themselves, then I'm not going to bother reading this. I don't have the time to go look it up myself. If the person giving me this information has not even mentioned the source or linked to it, then maybe it's not worth my time at all. Why have they done it so poorly? Just as I feel with opinion polls, we shouldn't throw them all out. So when I'm giving journalists tips for how to do a better job of reporting on opinion polls, I tell them that the temptation is great in election season to report on every opinion poll that comes out there. But if the opinion poll has landed in your inbox without any mention of who funded it, as well as the methodology and who commissioned it, you as a newsroom should be able to draw a bar and say we're not going to use these. So, not all of us have, everybody has work to do and not all of us have the time to go and ferret out the underlying information around every narrative. Perhaps the least we can do is draw this line, that if you are not going to mention the source, do some effort in linking, do some effort in explaining methodology, then you're not good enough for me to read, and I'll seek out another source that does a better job of it.
And in my line of work, I'm doing some work in the technology area. We're all hearing about AI and the deep fakes, if you know what deep fakes are, and that's coming. And I think there's going to be an exponential rise in the quantum of deep fakes which are going to come as well. So not only false narratives, but deep fakes also. This is the flip side of AI. So I think that we will have to be a lot more conscious as well. Once I agree, but it may sound a bit utopian from an Indian context that rely on the journalistic integrity. But I think we'll have to. It was not on camera. All right. Okay.
Yeah. Though I just feel that so even without having deep fakes, we could have TV channels go on about nano chips embedded in notes.
I know, absolutely.
It didn't need any deep fakes. It just needed someone
to do
just
that.
talk complete nonsense on TV, and it was acceptable.
Yeah, and there's some noisy channels also, right? Yes. Okay, so before we go there, I have another question. Not a question, just a point here. Men don't work at home. Talk to us
to be waving the flag for men here, but I'll start by doing that. Yes, men do very little work inside Indian homes, but men do the bulk of paid work outside. So let's just start with that part of it, which is not, which also says something about the way everything is structured. But let's start with that, which is that in most countries, there are an equal number of working age men and women, and so there are an equal number of men and women in the workforce, maybe little more men than women. But in India, that's not the case at all. It is a far more masculinized workforce than in almost anywhere else in the world. We have one of the lowest rates of female labor force participation of any country in the world. We're like in the bottom 10% of countries with great company like Syria and Yemen over there. So it really is one of those numbers that's a standout. It's extremely low. The other thing that I find surprising is that even within women who are in the workforce, and this is something that I recently came across, so it's not in the book, but the majority of Indian women who are in the workforce even get paid no wages. So they're in the workforce, but they're doing unpaid work on household enterprises. So in rural areas, this means agriculture. In urban areas, it means like a thela or a little shop, where these are unpaid workers. So, we can look at the female labor force participation rate and feel good about it if it increases. But what do we mean by work? We mean work as something that gives you an independent wage, that gives you maybe some dignity, that gives you all of those things, which if you're not getting paid any wages for it, it's not work in the classic sense. I mean, it's very hard work, but it's not all of the things that we feel like work can lead to. So men do the vast majority of paid work in India is the first point I want to make. And yes, the other part of it is that women do a lot of work as well, but they are not being paid for it and they're doing it inside their homes. So that is the sort of gender division of work that exists. To that point, to that extent, I think that's something that we can all sort of make sense of. But the one number that I find beyond the pale is that even unemployed men do less hours of housework than employed women. That is something that Indian statistics show, and that I find, there is no explanation for that beyond a very sort of gendered understanding of what is women's work and what is men's work. That even if you are a working woman, going home and cooking and childcare and elder care is your job as compared to unemployed men as well. So, there is a gender division, there is a lot of paid work that men are doing, very long hours, among the longest hours in the world in fact. And this is often very hard work, it's often at very low wages, so there is all of that. But there's no denying that there exists a very strong gendered notion of what is work.
I think to your last point, anecdotally, has anybody ever taken the Mumbai suburban trains? Ever? Have you ever traveled? And have you done it during rush hours in the evening? Right? You will see most women.
Your mic is not up.
It's okay, my voice is. I don't know. I think it doesn't want to. Yeah. And you will see that a lot of women are cutting their vegetables so that they're proactively preparing for the meal, for the husband to relish the meal. So yeah, I think it's anecdotally visible as well.
That is a very enduring image of
It is perhaps true in my household as well, so I confess. But that's
Guaranteed yourself a safe passage.
Safe passage, yes. I've admitted to my crime. We touched upon this initially, but if you can just quickly, rapid fire, tell us where can we publicly access a lot of the information which you've used and quoted in the books as well, or perhaps you can just send a list out, but just rapid fires, 3 or 4 real sources for the information you were talking about.
So again, I will say that as it exists in its current form, which is going to mospeed.gov.in, which is Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, finding these reports and then making sense of them is not a fun Sunday activity. I wouldn't wish it on anybody. And I don't feel that this is the way people should have to access information. So there is good data journalism that goes on out there in India. So there is very good work that's done by the Hindu and Mint, Hindustan Times as well. I would say these are three good examples. There is a dedicated data journalism website called India Spend that does good work as well. So I think all of them do good work. They show their sources, and you would find most of this work as well there.
And there's one Ahmedabad. There's a center in Ahmedabad or somewhere. I think somewhere you quoted Center for Entrepreneurship or something. Anyway, I could be confused. No, it's okay. Okay, let's go to the next point. If this works, yeah. So here we are. At least in this room, we know who we are. Once Rukmini tells us what this is all about. Yeah.
So let me start by saying that these numbers have been recently, as of earlier this week, updated. But because I have not seen the raw data yet, I have only not seen the raw data is not out yet. I don't feel confident talking about it. So you will have read it in the media, and I'll tell you what's in the media. Then I'll So let's have full transparency. The official number that's come out now, so this was 2017, this number, and I have that, I do see 2017 in the book. It says as of 2021, this number is 20,000 rupees. That if you spend 20,000 rupees a month, but that includes rent, if you pay rent, or EMIs, so it includes all of your spending on everything. But so full context, as of 2021, this number is 20,000. Now, the reason I won't say anything more about this is because I haven't yet got the raw data. This is like a press release that's been there in the media, but let's assume it's accurate even, and we can even talk about 20,000. So I think what the numbers have ended up showing me is that all of us like to think that we are not the elite, because we think of the elite as someone we can demonize and sort of blame ills on, and we like to think of ourselves as middle class. It is a common pastime, particularly when the budget comes out, for all of us to say to each other, but what about the middle class? Which is a great question, except we are not that middle class. What about the middle class for sure, but the middle class is more likely to be maids and drivers. So they are not the poor, they are a step up from the poor. They have maybe salary jobs and more dependable incomes, but that's not us. We are not the middle class. And again, I think there is a strong bubble effect over here, which is and in a way it's a different bubble effect. You see other people's lives maybe in on page 3 or somewhere, and you assume that there's a lot of them, and that's very different from you. So I think owning that we are all not just in the top 5%, but probably in the top 1% of urban India, and what that means is something that we've just all got to get more comfortable with. Maybe that will help us demonize the rich less. But let me make one point, is that there is a lot of extremes that goes on. So the average and the highest and lowest are very different. And I will say that within that 1%, it's very likely that the incomes of the top few thousand are way ahead of what ours are, and so that in our minds is really the elite. But then at least let's reframe our understanding of that elite to maybe the top 0.00001% of the country, while accepting that we are in the top 1% of the country. And I think with that comes the ownership of many things. You have to accept all the privilege that comes with it. You have to accept how different your reality is from the rest of Indian reality. So there's many things that we need to own up to when we can no longer blame a sort of imagined elite.
So I think if you plot a sine curve, the bulge is in this group, and then you have a very long tail of groups.
Absolutely. If you do it as percentiles, and I have a chart there in the book, the 1%, the top percentile is a skyscraper, and the rest of it is Bombay Charles.
Right. One intervention I can propose for you to do research is that if you go to a place called Delhi, and if you were to do research on the elite, and you will probably find that they're all elite optically, but they may actually be middle class. in the way they represent themselves.
Point.
Do you agree with that, guys?
Sure.
Please come on.
I feel like this is an analogy that is lost on someone south of the Hindu. I absolutely
Given that you were in Delhi, I'm sure you would have seen.
But when I was in Delhi, I was a starting journalist who, ate chart in that UPSC lane. So, yeah.
Yeah, so why don't you, summon me to conduct this research? I'll be glad. Okay. I have no gripe against people from Delhi.
We all have lots of gripes against people from Delhi.
Okay. Before we go to this next slide, maybe just this is like rapid fire, conscious of time. So, in one line, difficult one, how would you distinguish between a fact and an opinion? I know it's obvious, but what advice would you give us?
No, it isn't obvious because then all of the Indian media wouldn't look the way it does. There's absolutely no distinction between fact and... No, this is something that, I used to feel that what people had a hard time figuring out was what is objective. Well, now I feel that people have a hard time figuring out what is subjective. So they are not able to see their own subjective opinions as being subjective. That's something people find very hard to grapple with. In fact, in any journalism training I do, and now I have done this in other countries as well, I find that getting people to keep their opinions out of the way they write is the hardest thing to do because it is entirely unexamined. This is not a part of people's minds that they have examined at all. That what is the fact, what is my opinion, and where am I inserting my opinion into this? So maybe a good exercise for all of us would be to try to write something that we know about factually without inserting our opinion, and perhaps it's hard for everyone to do. I do know that it's a huge frustration for me while dealing with student journalists. So I don't think that there is anything particularly wrong in having subjectivity and in having biases and in having strongly held beliefs. It's only the recognition that's important. So I'm under no false assumptions here that what I provide is an objective reality free of bias. All I can say is that I try not to cherry pick things. But for sure, what I choose to look at, what I don't, is driven by that subjectivity. So I would say that there isn't even maybe sometimes a hard line, but being able to acknowledge it and acknowledge when something is an opinion is probably harder than anything else. Because honestly, what is a fact devoid of any opinion is really very difficult to get at beyond the sciences.
I guess we all must write. All of us moving away from reading so many sources, I think we should all make an attempt to write so that we test whether what are we writing, is it facts and opinions. So good advice as well, thank you.
Yes, and I think it also, when you spoke about AI earlier, part of the sort of, you keep seeing people ask a question to one of these ChatGPTs or Gemini AI and then feel shocked at what comes out as a response. I think part of it is people's own inability to figure out the difference between fact and opinion. When they're asking something, it's usually asking for an opinion, it's asking for a take on something. And then that take not being your own take is fine. I mean, it's what, it'll evolve algorithmically. So it is much harder to figure out the difference between a fact and an opinion than we would imagine. Good.
Okay, the consumption conundrum. On this slide here, how do we spend money? This is interesting. The slide is not conveying the message the way it should be, but maybe you can just spend a minute or so and tell us how are we spending our money.
Yeah, so it's one of those things where if you look at over time, you do see a story of growth, development, and of what being freed in a way or moving away from poverty means for people and means for a country. Because you do consistently and significantly see this shift away from the bulk of money being spent, not even just on food, but on cereals. Like literally rice and wheat was what people had to spend, what the poor in particular was spending more than half of their money on. Now, one of the differences is that much more cereal is provided through welfare schemes, so people have to spend less on it themselves. But also, as you get richer, it frees up your money from having to just to spend on these things. And what do people choose to spend on when they have more of it? They spend on health and education. They spend so much more on education. We see that so quickly. So this is why, I mean, I don't want to call things good news stories or bad news stories, but you do see this as a consistent story of growth and development over the decades, that the spending on core essentials is reducing and it's opening up space for people to spend on what they want to, including things like eating out, eating packaged food, which often with people in urban areas is often a necessity. Even you see so many people at like rajma chawal stalls, because they who's going to be able to pack something early in the morning? They're often eating out. So you do see in urban India especially a big increase in spending on eating out and on packaged food.
And I think that also is anecdotally evident. I'll just give you my personal example, because last week we were in south of Rajasthan, short break, and we went to various villages spotting animals. And as we were going through various villages, just outside the villages, there was litter of packaged food. There was just amazing amount of litter. So packaged food, as you said, so even there you can beginning to see that spend shifting as well. But I think what I also took from this thing as well, that whilst we are getting richer based on statistics or developing, but our need for cereal has not reduced as well. So that quantum was the baseline. So maybe there was underreporting earlier, and now it is getting corrected, or whatever else is happening.
It's just the relative share that we're having to spend on cereals that's reducing.
Exactly.
So we're not eating less of
exactly.
it, but we have more money to spend on other things that are not just rice and meat.
And this perhaps is a good idea for at least the non-middle class, which are so many, that we go into diets and try and eat less carbohydrates and sort of balance it out as well. Okay, so next one. Lots of data here, but once again, I purposely pulled this fact out of from your book, and my only one take is, what's the blue collar job? And just tell us what's going on. How are we actually working in it?
So I think if you ask people, so I live in Chennai for example, if you ask people in Chennai to draw what the average working woman and working man looks like, what their jobs are, they would draw you an IT worker with a Infosys lanyard around their neck, TCS lanyard, taking the metro. That's the sort of, and I think it differs in different cities, but across the country, in urban India, the most common job for women is domestic work, so maids and cooks in houses, and the most common job for men is casual labor on construction sites. And I think, again, it's numbers that have been the same for decades, so we know this is the case. But it hasn't really seeped into public conversation. We don't talk about domestic work or about construction as being the stereotypical Indian worker.
And this stereotypical middle class as well.
Absolutely, right. Yeah. So this is much closer to any notion of what a middle class is likely to look like than our notion of it.
Exactly. Interesting. You don't have to agree on what I'm going to say here, but how would you think about, if you were to put a framework to this, that good data leads to rich information and phenomenal insight, but equally bad data leads to just pathetic insight? That's the framework I have used in my work as well. Would you agree with that? Or what would be your take? Or how should we look at things, correlating these three aspects?
I think I would add one layer, which is interpretation over there. So yes, bad data certainly leads to bad insights. We have examples of this. Where incorrectly looking at things have caused great harm to insights or understanding of the country. But similarly, there are examples of having good data, but just poor interpretation has over time led to bad insights from it. And I think there's also now, in particular, a lot of bad faith cherry picking of numbers and sort of willful misrepresentation of numbers to suit agendas. So all of that together can add to bad intelligence. But yes, the bedrock has to be lots of data collected well and made widely available.
And the example of our first thing, the sexual crime Delhi example, is good data, but our interpretations are
Right, so either taking it too literally, or then using numbers that can tell you one small thing, but using them to tell you about a world of things that actually those numbers can't really tell you. So over interpreting numbers as well.
So the next one we're going to talk about is this migrant issue. And I don't know if you, at least I spend half my time in Maharashtra, and there's a lot of talk amongst the political rhetoric around migrants. And here we are. Here is some information which Rukmini has pulled out. I would urge everybody to take 2 seconds to read this as well, and then Rukmini, you can attack this.
So this sort of rhetoric is also very
I'm sure
strong in the
southern
states,
states as
in
well.
Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Kerala, across the board, very strong anti-migrant, and often this translates into anti-North Indian migrant rhetoric. There's absolutely no denying that this runs through, and whether it sometimes has sort of some economic basis or not is almost irrelevant given the tone of some of this talk. Migration, I think, is actually one of the most poorly understood and most poorly communicated aspects of India. So, first of all, the majority, and this is numbers, not an opinion, but the specific numbers are in the book. The vast majority of migration in India is rural to rural. It's not rural to urban at all. So it is people moving from one part of a state, within state, rural to rural. So within district, migration is the largest part of migration. Then within state is the next biggest, and interstate is rare. It's extremely rare. Less than 5% of Indians live in a state other than the one they were born in. So moving to a state, another state, is a sort of epic journey. It does not happen commonly at all. And another sort of dimension to this is that while our understanding often is that the poorest are the ones who migrate, it's very much not the case. In fact, the poorest are least likely to migrate. The share of migrants is highest among richer groups because you need capital to be able to do the very act of migration. So again, we have to rethink who we think of as rich and poor. So once you include people in more blue-collar jobs in your understanding of the better off, then the world begins to make more sense. So one is that most migration in India is very close, very short distances, and rural to rural, not rural to urban. So the sense of people from villages flooding into cities is completely off. In fact, one of the questions economists often ask is why there is so little migration in India. There's probably a need for greater migration that would drive economic growth. The other thing is that the vast majority of migrants in India are women who migrate for marriage. So if you think of living somewhere different from where you were born, most migration in India is marriage migration by women. Economic migration is actually much smaller, and then it's often driven by men. So yeah, again, it's one of those things that there's probably too little migration in India rather than this sort of common panic about migrants from the north flooding into southern states. And one of the things that southern states do need to consider is they are aging fast. They're aging fast. They're also getting very rich, and they are finding it hard to find labor, including agricultural labor. Now, if you combine all of this with an anti-migrant rhetoric, then who do you think is going to come to work on your fields? Where are they going to come from, and how are you going to pay them wages that you feel that you can afford? It just doesn't all add up.
Interesting. I just want to confess that I'm a migrant.
So am I.
Yeah.
I am in fact a marriage migrant, so I am the
Yes.
median Indian migrant.
I'm an economic and a marriage migrant to this day. So conscious of time, and if I were to, obviously I had the benefit of reading vast amount of the book, but I think the lesson which we have all learned, and that artists also comment on that, that if the methodology of the survey and the research is wrong, it leads to poor quality data or capture of data, leading to misrepresentation of the facts or misinterpretation of the facts, resulting in poor analysis, distorted narratives, and misguided perception.
Absolutely.
Do you agree with that?
Yes.
And here is an example, which I'm going to post for you, which was about this as well. So, men are not voting or voting less. Okay? Men are committing more crime. Older men oppose intercaste marriages. Men don't do housework. Rich men spend more on non-food items. That's an interesting narrative. I'm sure a lot of what you like to take back home. What do you think? What do you think about this? I just made it up. No, I've taken it from the deck. Yeah, you just said it exactly. So what do you think about it? And I can add that men are also economic migrants as well. So, what's your take on that? Example of a false narrative.
I would add about 5 asterisks to each of those points. No, it's just to broadly say that there are many slices through which we can look at numbers, and while gender is certainly one of those, it is also the case that other demographic slices, including both caste and class, are very determinant of differences in a way that goes beyond even gender in some cases. So there's many sort of axes of differences to think about, one of which is gender.
Yeah. So let me give it another shot. And this is going to sound really good, as she said right earlier, that good storytelling is important. Women are voting more. Women do not commit crime. Older women are not opposed to intercaste marriages. Women do homework and work very well. And rich women don't spend money on shopping bags. How does that sound? Anyway, I just thought I'd lighten the atmosphere, but maybe I've done well on time, so...
We're kind of out, but in the interest of time, we'll take 2 very quick questions.
Some questions.
We'll start with her and then we'll take yours and then we'll
Try and take 2.
Yeah, I'll take 2.
Yeah. When you were thinking about this book, how did you grapple with the idea of context and ethics? So my biggest takeaway from my advanced statistics class was always, you can let the numbers tell you the story you wanted to tell you, right? So it is hard to take politics out of numbers, in both in the methodology of it and in the analysis of it, right? And you saw that just as, when you were thinking about it, how did you think about 2 things? One is what to include in the book. So I see you included a lot of opinion survey polling, for example. Now, when they look at the X and the Y axes, for example, when you looked at whether more liberal means, more educated means more liberal, or what that goes to, it leaves out a lot of other axes, right? What is happening with the political context, what is happening with the international context and all of that. So how did you deal with that when thinking about what to include? And second, the ethic question about how people will take away the analysis from your numbers. How worried were you in how they would choose to take the story they wanted to? For example, even the Delhi crime data, for example. So how did you grapple with that and deal with that in the book?
She's asking for the recipe.
So I like to think of this as maybe the ground floor of a lot of what can come later. I think we've started by not having enough basic data to look at, not having a place that we can consolidate information that we already have. And I'm quite happy to work with that sort of low-hanging fruit over here. I think there's a lot more that can be built on it, and a lot more that will come, a lot more that I want to do. And I think that will follow. I think there's a few sort of bars that I try to make sure are met in the data that I look at. And while, not all of the detail comes in here or in the book, but in the methodologies of the opinion polls that I look at, and I could talk quite a lot about the opinion polls that I don't think are good and that are in fact widespread and very widely used in academia that I don't think are very good. So I think there is a bar that has been met by the opinion polls that I do use here, which in the interest of time I don't get into at length. I think there's a lot to think about what more can be done. And that will happen. And I think of this as sort of building the ground floor. In terms of what people take away from it, I don't feel no responsibility, but I'm not overburdened by that responsibility either. So I felt that happened quite strongly actually in the case of the Delhi cases, where I went in concerned that some of the feminist lawyers might feel that what this was doing was making it seem as if there was no violence against women. But that turned out to be an unfounded fear, because that was not at all the way this was taken by feminist lawyers at all, who in fact through their own groundwork had seen these restrictions on young people's agency and were as bothered by it as I had been after looking at it. So I think it fits into a wide understanding of politics. And so my concern that this would be picked up by people to then see violence against women as equal to false cases. When bad faith actors take this in bad faith, it's a them problem rather than a me problem.
We take one more question.
Just a quick fact and a question. Coming from the Department of Child Rights, every month we get the number, the entire state number, that how many people have complained for the POCSO Act, right? So, January we had about 8,658, that's the precise number, complaints. Now we don't know that's the fact or fake or real or whatever. Now how many, the iceberg thing that you showed, how many complaints were actually filed were only 68. That is January 2024 I'm talking about. Right, so my question to you is that how does the ministry handle this? Because when the data goes to NCPCR, that is the ministry, it says that 700 and so number complaints came. And that is how they mention it to the media, and that is how the numbers come out. So if you have any idea, how does the ministry handle these numbers on what are the complaints and how many are actually filed? If you can just throw some light on that.
Read the
Sure.
book.
So let me give you the equivalent in crimes against adults. Let me give you the equivalent here, because that exists in the number. See, POCSO, because of the nature of the act,
Right.
the detailed statistics and the details of the cases are not publicly available,
Right.
as it should be.
Sure.
However, there is good legal research that happens in this. So, for example, Vidhi Legal Center based in Bangalore did a sample survey of I think 1,000 court rulings under POCSO, where in fact they found the same thing, by the way, that these same sections,
Right.
the majority of them were underage relationships,
Right.
where POCSO was used. Some of them were not even underage. You can put POCSO right there in the FIR,
True.
and then it will take 2 years to figure out if the person was 18 or not, by which time the relationship has broken up and success has been achieved. So what typically happens with the way the numbers are is that there will be complaint. These work as sort of, imagine it as a cascading effect.
Yeah.
Complaints filed, then number closed, then number, then make it to FIR stage, charge sheet stage, etc.
Right.
So at least with police statistics that have to do with adults, it's followed in this way. POCSO doesn't, we don't get the detailed statistics in the same way, but I imagine that the numbers are maintained in the same way. So complaint filed and then FIR, charge sheet, etc. So you can also see where things fall between the cracks.
Okay, so the ministry accepts the number of complaints,
Yeah,
right?
we do it offline. No?
That
Let's-
specifically I don't know.
Let's go offline.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt now because we're really out of time. I'm so sorry, I can't take more questions. But thank you so much, Chirag. Thank you, Rukmini, for this. It was a very informative session. I'm sure we're all going back with lots to think about. May I invite Mr. Ditendra Rana to please felicitate our guests.
Can we please have a big round of applause?
Look at sir. Sir, look at.
Oh, for me as well.
Yes. Really life for us. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us. We'll see you next time, and there's a book for the drill. Thank you.
छोटी बत्ती